Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant, erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. I'm your host, Dr. Pavini Moray, and today it's such a pleasure to introduce you to Ifetayo Harvey. Ifetayo is the marketing coordinator and founder of the POC Psychedelic Collective. At the Drug Policy Alliance, Ife manages DPA's social media and spearheaded the LGBTQ+ issue team. Ifetayo founded the POC Psychedelic Collective, where she creates spaces for POC to heal and learn about psychedelics. In 2014, she graduated from Smith College with a degree in History and African Studies. She was awarded the Outstanding Leader Award. In 2016, Ifetayo was added to the 30 Under 30 Caribbean Changemakers list. She values justice and independence, which guide her trajectory. She grew up in Charleston, South Carolina with her many siblings and mom, and in her free time, she enjoys television, fitness, crafts, and playing her, oh my gosh, how do I say that? Euphonium.
Yeah.
What's a euphonium? We're going to talk about what a euphonium is and listening to music. So you can find out more about Ifetayo on her work, on her Twitter account, which is twitter.com/if3tay0. Ifetayo, hi, welcome to Bespoken Bones. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's just talk about what the heck is a euphonium.
Yes. Well, a euphonium is a brass instrument. It looks like a tuba. So I often tell people it's a baby tuba. Same shape and everything. It's just probably half the size. And the pitch is similar to a trombone. So
okay.
you see it more often in wind bands than you do orchestras. But yeah, I've been playing music since I was a kid, and I still play occasionally here in New York with a community band called the Lesbian and Gay Big Apple Corps. And
it's such a great name.
Yes, we do a lot of fun concerts, a lot of themed, like my first concert with them was like an anime video game themed concert, and it was really fun. So yeah, we're a really old community band here in New York, about 125 members, and yeah, music has been a part of my life for a long time. So it's one of those hobbies of mine that keep me going.
Is it something in your family? Is there music?
Yeah, a little bit. So I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters, and my 2 sisters all played music as well. They actually taught me how to play keyboard and piano when I was little. And so my older sister, Shanna, she's a violinist. And then my second oldest sister, she played trumpet for a really long time. And then I also have a brother who he has been into hip hop, produced a couple songs and things like that. So I would say we're musical in a lot of ways. And, you know, my mom growing up, I was just very accustomed to my family just like blasting music really loudly. Like it didn't matter if it was like 9 a.m. I just got used to sleeping through all of that. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds like definitely music's a big part of your family culture, and yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. Did you all ever play music together?
You know, we haven't. Me and my sisters never played together. My mom used to always joke and say that we should do something like that, but we've never played together. I think it's because of our age range. Like my oldest sister Shanna, she's 10 years older than me. So by the time I got into playing music, she was already kind of past that period. But she's been actually teaching her daughter how to play violin. Her daughter is 7. So she's kind of passing it down a little bit, and that's something I also want to do when I have kids is teach them music, because I really enjoy teaching young kids music. I think it's really important, and it was really a game changer for me in middle school and high school. So that's something I look forward to as I get older too.
Yeah, that's great, because what I hear is just this, like, your sister taught you, and then teaching her own kids, and you want to teach your kids, that there is this like lineage of teaching and learning and sharing. Yeah, this thing that's beautiful. Thank you. I feel envious of families who have that. Like, I mean, it's such a beautiful. I mean, I think there's lots of ancestral blessings that we get, right? And some families get cooking, and some families have different. Like, everybody in the family is into weaving or theater, and your family is music. It's really great.
Yeah. It's really interesting because when you said cooking, that also set up another alarm bell in my head, because that's something that me and all of my siblings are into. Like every one of us knows how to cook, some better than others, but it's also something that we bond over a lot. It's just we send each other pictures, and yeah, both of my sisters are very, very into that. One of my sisters, she can do like amateur baking really, really well. And it's just something she does for fun. So I feel like that's also something that that runs in our family.
Do you have favorite family recipes?
Definitely on my mom's side. My mom's family is American. My father's family is Jamaican. So on my mom's side of the family, one of my favorite memories is just growing up and going out to the country where my family is originally from, and having everyone just gather for Thanksgiving. And my grandma, who's 83 now, she used to cook for everyone. And one of my favorite things was her cornbread stuffing that she made. It's just like so addictive. It's just like you could just eat it nonstop. And then there's a lot of women in my family who do cakes. So red velvet cakes, key lime pie cakes, pound cakes. And where my mom's family is from is a very small town in Georgia, about 2,000 people. So, everyone's very tight knit there, and folks know my grandma, my aunt, that they make cakes. So it's pretty normal for someone to buy a cake or buy a pie or something like that.
And you grew up in South Carolina.
Yes, I grew up in Charleston. So I didn't grow up in the rural area where my mom is from, but we would always visit.
Yeah, I mean, you grew up on the sea, right?
Yeah, I grew up, 20 minutes from the beach, and it's something I took for granted when I was a kid. I didn't realize how special that was.
Yeah.
I actually hated the beach when I was a kid. I didn't like going. I thought it was annoying, and now I'm like, oh my god, I would.
Yeah. Yeah. How was Charleston?
Yeah, growing up in Charleston was really interesting. I feel lucky to have grown up in Charleston at the time that I did, because it's changed a lot in the past 10 years. It's definitely not the same place that I grew up in, but I felt very safe there, and I felt like I got to have like a relatively like normal childhood and teenage years as well. I grew up going to public school, and also just having a lot of siblings and growing up in a mixed working class neighborhood. I felt like I got to know people of all different backgrounds. I always thought or now I guess I realize how important it is for me to have that upbringing. Going to public schools, and also another thing in my house is that when you turn 15 or 16, you need to get a job. And so I started working in fast food when I was 16, and, working 20 to 40 hours a week sometimes. And I think that also just gave me a lot of knowledge and experience in terms of like emotional intelligence, and just learning how to deal with people. Food industry is stressful, and I have so much respect for people who do that work now.
I agree with you 100%. I think that all of us at some point in our lives, hopefully more early on, should be in food service. That we should have to, because it just helps so much with learning to consider other people's needs and track, right, how other people are doing, how they're feeling, and what they're needing, and to really be aware. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it did for me. It's kind of like, was like the opposite of being self-centered, was being a server, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you also, you build relationships. You build relationships with your coworkers, and then also some of your customers, or your regulars. There's some of my regulars who I got pretty close with, who, went out of their way to help me when I needed it, or supported me when that job ended up closing for good, shutting its doors. So, and then also I grew up very, very shy, just like painfully shy as a kid. And so being thrown into fast food, like, kind of forced me to learn how to talk to people more, and sometimes in a very direct way, because, as I'm sure you know, people can get very, very disrespectful when you're behind the counter. So it teaches you how to deal with all kinds of people.
Really it does.
Mm-hmm.
And how to hold your center when whatever is coming at you is coming at you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
How is it? I'm curious because Charleston has. I just recently moved back to the South after being gone for about 15 years, and I'm in North Carolina. Charleston has a really intense history, right? It's a very, and I've been there, I don't know, a handful of times, maybe a dozen. It has a gravitas about it, just being there, it feels like you feel the weight of that history. And I'm just wondering, how was it to grow up in a place where the history of the place, I'm guessing, was present in many ways? And just curious what you noticed.
Oh yeah. I'm glad that you asked that question, because I think growing up in Charleston, I was forced at a young age to kind of reckon with that history, and not ignore it. I think that for other folks who grow up in different parts of the country, the West, the Northeast, things like that, they have an idea of what it's like, but they don't actually know. And so when I talk to some of my friends who are from other regions, and I tell them that, like, yeah, I used to go on field trips to plantations in elementary, middle school, and they're just shocked, because they're just like, oh, wait, y'all still have plantations like up and running? I'm like, yes, there's so many plantations that are, historical sites for tourists, but people get married there. There's hotels and restaurants, and I remember just going to these places as a kid and knowing that they were sites of enslavement, but that never really being talked about in a direct way, and in a sensitive way that honored the fact that I'm a Black kid and this is a site of our suffering. It was just kind of brushed over, like, oh, well, those are the slave quarters over there. And next we have the garden kind of thing. And so I grew up knowing that history, and also just knowing other history, with the Revolutionary War. I remember going on a field trip to a dungeon, like, like that's a touristy thing. And so in some ways it made me desensitized to certain things, because now looking back, as a kid going to a plantation, that's just so
so fucked up.
Yeah, it's so fucked up. It's so fucked
Oh
up.
my God.
And just going through the school system and going to public schools that were majority Black. I would say most of my schools were like 60% Black, 40% white, but all of my teachers were white. And so
Yeah.
having teachers, particularly history, who, were spouting off the history of the Civil War and things like that. And again, slavery is just something that's brushed over and it's not really talked about. And then it's a weird juxtaposition because here in Charleston and on the coast, we have this very rich Gullah Geechee culture that has totally impacted everything about Charleston, but it's not being talked about through all of these institutions like schools. It's recognized, but I think that Charleston can do a much, much better job of upholding that because it is dying out due to gentrification. And then, and another thing in terms of like the part of your question, like feeling that weight, Charleston, growing up in Charleston, it's really common for people to talk about ghosts, kind of how it is in New Orleans too. And so that was something that I often thought about. It's just like all the different spirits that might be lingering there. And, sometimes I have family members who would come in from other places and they would say like, whoa, I feel like I've been here before, because that's how strong that presence of the history of enslavement is. And so, I, as a kid, just when we go out of town in car trips, we'd be driving down historical highways where a lot of these plantations are. And in my head, I would just envision, Black people running through the woods. Because that was something I thought about a lot in terms of like escaping enslavement. We're always taught about Harriet Tubman growing up, especially during Black History Month. And I know she made several trips down south. And so I feel very lucky because that kind of thing was something that my mom emphasized to me growing up, was just the importance of our ancestors' struggle and how their resilience and their resistance helped us get to where we are today. And just imagining that, there are people working these plantations and fighting to escape. They were running through the woods and the swamps at 2-3 a.m. There's no such thing as Google Maps. There's no flashlights. They're not only dodging the white slave masters, they're also dodging snakes, alligators, wild boar, like all these other external factors. And still so many of them managed to escape or to buy their freedom and things like that. So, in a lot of ways that growing up around that history has definitely inspired me, because like I know it so well. It's in my culture, and no one can tell me no one can tell me different, because I know where I'm from, and I've seen the plantations. I've seen, the roads that little African children were forced to build. And so, yeah, I feel grateful for that history, because I think that for a lot of people, even some of us Black Americans, that history feels distant. To me, it's not distant. It feels very, very close, because walking around in Charleston, you see these old historical buildings. And so, that history is right there in your face. So yeah, I'm I always had mixed feelings about Charleston growing up. I always felt like it was too conservative for me, not open-minded enough. But at the same time, it's a very beautiful place, and there's a very beautiful culture there. And I know that I'll always have complicated feelings about Charleston, but over the years, I've come to appreciate it for what it is. And I hope that, what I'm seeing now is like an online movement to kind of really highlight Gullah Geechee culture more. And I love that. And I hope that that kind of thing continues, because like I said, it's a dying culture, but it's also very sacred. And I think that Charleston in general isn't recognized enough for it.
Yeah, thank you. There's just so much in what you just shared that I want to dive in a little bit more deeply with. Because what you're saying is actually something that I'm noticing that's really quite profound, is the value putting your body on the land where your people lived and suffered, right? That you said, I know who I am. No one can tell me, because I know, right? I saw the plantations. I saw what happens. And yeah, I mean, I recently had a friend die, and we are distant, we're far apart geographically. And I just noticed how, like, the impact of the grief was different in being distant, right? And you're saying that, of like, that for other folks, it's more, not theoretical. I don't mean to be dismissive like that, but like that there's just this deep value in, because the land holds it, right? You go there and you're like, and the stone of the buildings. I mean, that's, I think, what I noticed the most when I was there, like, just like that feeling of that. Yeah. And it's both oppressive, but also that there's this sense of that you got of really knowing who you are, who your people are, where you're from, that identity. Yeah. Yeah, that's just a new take on it that I haven't really thought about before.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're saying like putting your body on the land. Yeah, I also have been doing some thinking around that, because I got connected to someone recently. Her name is Nova Scott, and they were doing a project around slave dwellings and plantations, and like experimenting with like spending the night there. And at first I'm like, oh, that sounds kind of crazy, but but also very powerful. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think that folks tend to shy away from, because it's like, oh, I don't want to revisit that trauma and pain, but I do think that there can be some healing in using our bodies to reclaim that space.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your work, because kind of the childhood that you shared of being a really painfully shy child, and playing music and food. It sounds like just very wholesome, like a lot of family and support, um and your work is really edgy, right? Like, okay, so help me understand, from Charleston to being the director of a psychedelic research institute. Help me understand that journey a little bit.
Okay, sure. So I never thought that I'd be doing the work I do now at the Drug Policy Alliance, or at my collective, POC Psychedelic Collective. And that's because I was growing up, I was not into drugs. I was not into experimenting with stuff. I was really a goody two shoes for a lot, for a lot of my growing up. And that said, I think part of that was because of my father's incarceration. So my father went to prison when I was 4, and he was sentenced to 15 years for a drug charge. And he ended up being deported in 2004 after serving about 8 years of his sentence. And so, growing up as a kid, I was again forced to kind of reckon with that, with the prison system and with the war on drugs. Of course, I didn't have that language back then, but I remember when my mom told me that my dad went to prison, and I was hysterical and really upset. But even then in my mind as a kid, I was like, well, why does he have to go to prison just because he was selling drugs? Like, I had I guess, an idea of what drugs were, but I didn't really know what they were, as a 5 or 6 year old. And so that said, even in my mind, I thought, well, why does he have to go to prison? If people want this substance, then they should be able to buy it from him, right? And so that was just something I always held in my mind growing up. And, after my dad was released from prison, obviously our relationship changed because I was able to talk on the phone with him more freely and, yeah, get to know him a lot better. While he was incarcerated, we always wrote each other letters back and forth, but we never spoke by phone. And so, I held a lot of shame and guilt within myself around that because I didn't know how common it was for people to go to prison. I thought that I was the only one. And so I never really talked about it that much to like my friends or even to my siblings. It was just always something that, wasn't talked about very like in the forefront. And when I got to college, I remember I was doing this pre-orientation program for students of color. And that was where I first like shared about my experience growing up in with my dad in prison and how much that impacted me and how because of that, I was depressed and suicidal and anxious and all these other things. And I remember after I shared, a couple other students in the program, you know, came up to me and was like, "Oh, well, my mom just went to prison," or um, my parents have been to prison, or my parents, folks really felt comfortable sharing with me after after I opened up. And so that was like kind of like my first taste of seeing the power of sharing your vulnerability with people. And so as I continued through college, I came across an internship program at the Drug Policy Alliance. And that was the first time I ever heard the terms drug policy and, all this language was very new to me. And looking at their website, I got excited because I never saw an organization that spoke about folks who use drugs or folks who, were involved in drugs in some way in a very compassionate framing. And so I was very, very struck by that. And so I, applied for the internship, and luckily Smith had a internship fund that I could use because I come from a working class background. And so doing an unpaid internship was not realistic for me. And so I did my interview and I said, hey, like, I'm passionate about this because my dad went to prison because of this. And after that, it was kind of a wrap. And so I did my internship there, and it was really great just being in that environment. And I continued to write about my experience with my dad. I wrote an op-ed about how children who have parents in prison, we bear the weight of that incarceration. And, when you sentence one person to prison, you're sentencing their whole family. You're sentencing some of their community as well. And so, that I started really getting into that and thinking about how kids are affected and families and things like that. And then during my senior year of college in 2014, I got diagnosed with depression. And that wasn't something new to me because I'd been depressed when I was a kid. But to hear it come like officially from like a healthcare professional is something different. And I was under a lot of pressure because I picked up a lot of extracurriculars and It's my senior year. And so, at the same time, the Drug Policy Alliance invited me to come speak at their conference in Denver, Colorado. And I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. They had just quickly asked me, and I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, whatever. I'll speak." And I've never been shy about speaking in front of people. I'm the kid who was voted like student council representative from like seventh grade all the way up to senior year of high school, and then through college. And so I was comfortable speaking in front of people. But then when I actually got to the conference, I realized that, oh, I'm speaking at the opening plenary, and there's 1,100 people here. So I was very, very nervous, and I ended up, I did the talk, and I ended up like breaking down and crying in front of everybody in the middle of my talk. And that was somewhat cathartic for me, because it was just like, I'm not ashamed anymore. And after that talk, so many people came up to me and were talking to me and telling me like, oh, like I also relate to your experience because I'm a dad who went to prison and I was separated from my kids. And so it was very, very moving and very healing for me. And so at the same time, I'm going through this new depression diagnosis, right? And so it's like I'm healing on one side of things, but on the other side, I'm still going through this thing currently, right? And so later at that conference, I remember going to an event or a panel that was about end of life treatment for people with terminal illnesses and using psychedelics to kind of heal that end of life anxiety. And so I remember just sitting in the back of the in the back of the room, just kind of putting two and two together. Like, oh, my friends at school, they experiment with psychedelics. They've told me a little bit about it, and I have this crippling anxiety right now, and I'm seeing some parallels in between like me feeling suicidal to these people who are dying. I'm not saying that they're the same. It's not. I was just saying some similarities in the type of stress. And so I was like, oh, maybe I should try psychedelics, because my other option is, Celexa or Wellbutrin. And my mom's an herbalist, self-taught, and she's been doing that for long before I was born. And so I wasn't comfortable with going the antidepressant route just because of my upbringing, and, not judging folks who do go that route, because I know it works for a lot of people. But I was just very, very cautious and scared to do that. And so I was really wanting an alternative. And so I was like, okay, well, mushrooms seem like the easiest thing for me to do. Or I know someone who does them, and I can probably get them somehow. And so after the conference was over, I went back to school and, asked my friends more questions like, hey, so how do I do a mushroom trip? And, they were giving me all these tips, and I'm very thankful and privileged to have gone to a school like Smith, because, to be able to access psychedelics it is a very privileged thing, and to be able to do them in a safe environment where you don't have to worry about criminalization, you don't have to worry about, other forms of violence, is a very big privilege. And so that's something I just want to acknowledge. And yeah, so I ended up, doing the mushroom trip, and I had friends there who were supportive of it. Like, they were my sitters and things like that. And so it kind of helped me kind of like unravel, when you're going through something, you feel like you have to keep it together, right? Keep up appearances and that just gave me a chance to just kind of just unravel and just do and process whatever I need to process. And it also challenged me in a new way, because for most of my life I've been an atheist. And so, spirituality was something that I grew up around because my mom is very spiritual, but she never like forced that on me. And so with psychedelics, that kind of made me, I was literally seeing the plants and the earth breathing. And I'm just like, whoa, like this, at first it was too overwhelming for me. Like I was on a really beautiful nature trail with my friend, and I was like enamored by all of it, but at the same time, it was just like, whoa, this is like unreal, And I was like, you have to take me back inside because this is just too much for me. So yeah, after that trip, I feel like it shifted my perspective in a lot of ways, because I was feeling, very depressed, suicidal, and things like that. And it kind of, showed me that there is a world beyond what we see every day. And also, everything around us is alive in a different way. And it made me want to feel more alive. So yeah, I started kind of, that kind of gave me a boost to be able to finish that semester. And I think with a lot of people who, when they first get into psychedelics, they want to like tell everyone about it and scream it from the mountaintops. And I wasn't like that, but I did, I did tell my friends about it and tell them how awesome it is and encourage them to try it out. And, um, yeah, so that kind of led me to be more passionate about it, and also just like really fascinated with like a lot of the research that was coming out around psychedelics, like the palliative care stuff, or like the PTSD or chronic pain, things like that. I was like, oh, this can help with so much. And I think because of my mom's background in herbalism, that really made it easy for me to understand, because I saw how plants growing up can be very powerful tools of healing as well. But this was just taking it to another level. So yeah, it definitely, it shifted my perspective in a lot of ways. And it also, I would say it also shifted my perspective around folks who use drugs. Just being at DPA and then also having that psychedelic experience shortly after my internship, I think that, we all have these assumptions and judgments about people who use drugs. And it varies depending on which drug you're talking about, right? We all have our biases, and, alcohol is probably the most common and most accepted, right? But if we look at someone who's using heroin or using methamphetamine, then our judgments are much more harsher and less humane and less compassionate. And so all of this stuff just made me kind of look at our world a lot differently, and also look at drug use a lot differently. And so it also just, was healing that childhood trauma of mine of my dad's incarceration, and kind of affirming what I felt when I was 5 years old, that like, okay, my dad shouldn't be sent to prison for selling a substance that people like. And I still feel that way. And I know a lot of people feel varying ways about drug sellers, but at the end of the day, what's caused the most harm are these punitive drug policies and mass incarceration.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would say also the epidemic of untreated trauma that people are trying to address, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're trying to self-medicate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that was something that was like oh, that makes so much sense. Like as part of my internship, I read Dr. Carl Hart's book, High Price, and he's a professor at Columbia, a neuroscience professor at Columbia, and he's Black. And so his book it reads almost like a memoir, but at the same time, he incorporates his knowledge of neuroscience, where he literally breaks down the drugs down to their chemical compounds. And he's showing like, look, meth and Adderall are very similar on a chemical level. And one of the points that he really drives home is that people don't get addicted to drugs because they just love drugs, like how it tastes. It's not that simple. It's like you said, people are treating trauma. People are dealing with unresolved trauma and unresolved needs that were never met. And so when you have that understanding, you're like, oh, that makes so much more sense than this dominant narrative that we usually have that tells us people who are addicted to drugs just want to mess up their lives and they don't care about anything but themselves, right? It's much more complicated than that. And so, and honestly, that kind of, it doesn't only apply to drugs, it applies to a lot of other things in our world, right? So yeah, it definitely shifted my perspective on all those things.
Would you speak to a little bit of the intersection of, I mean, you have been speaking to it, but a little bit in greater depth about kind of the stigma of using drugs, seeking drugs, and even, drugs that are, like you're talking about, medicinal and Blackness?
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, okay, yes. I think to answer that question, you kind of have to go back into history a little bit and really look at our first drug laws here in the US and understand that a lot of them were made because of racism, right? And so that's where that stigma around drug use and Blackness, I think, first started was, with early cocaine laws, early laws around marijuana were targeted towards Mexican immigrants. Opium laws were first targeted towards Chinese immigrants, right? And so the government was basically saying, like, it's not that these drugs are bad, it's that these folks of color using them is bad. And that's a problem for us, right? And so that's like the early 1900s. And then you kind of fast forward to Nixon and the war on drugs. I feel like there were certain tropes being created in that time. And then, when you go into Reagan, it's even more full-fledged, right? We have the quote-unquote crack epidemic, and then we have the welfare queen trope being put out by Republicans, and I think that because of the crack era, because of all the things associated with that, there's a very, very heavy stigma on drug use in general for Black people, right? Yes, like weed and alcohol are very, very accepted nowadays, but even still, if you are a Black person who uses those things openly, you do face a certain level of judgment, right? People think that you're a little weird or something's wrong with you, or I've heard people use language like, oh, if you're taking an edible before you get on a plane, you're a crackhead, that kind of thing. And so I think that a lot of us have drinking the drug war propaganda Kool-Aid. And so sometimes we judge each other, like as an intra-community thing, like we judge each other for using drugs. And there's definitely a level of respectability that is expected from Black people, especially in certain spaces, like more professional spaces. It's kind of implied that if you use drugs, then you can't be a functioning person, or you're irresponsible, like you're not smart and things like that. And so for Black people, it's just 10 times more magnified. You're being looked at like, and I hate to use this term because it's very stigmatizing to me, but like you're a fiend, basically. And so I think because of how the drug war impacted us, how so many of us saw our parents or uncles or aunts, our mothers being incarcerated, having addiction, we internalize that stigma and tell ourselves that, like, oh yeah, drugs are bad, and if you do drugs, then bad shit's going to happen to you, when it's actually more complicated. again, it's not the drugs, it's prohibition that makes them dangerous. Can you imagine if all these people who were suffering from addiction during the crack era were actually given some type of help or some type of support instead of being left to die? You know, it was treated that way. Would there be so much of a heavy stigma attached to drug use? And I don't think there would be. And it also reminds me of a piece that one of my colleagues wrote recently. My colleague, Alexis Martin, wrote a piece for Juneteenth and about pleasure for Black people and using drugs, and how a lot of times we feel the need to have to justify our drug use. Like, oh, well, you know, I smoke weed because I have a bad back or something like that. And I think what she was really saying is that we deserve to have pleasure. And if we get that from drugs, that's okay. You know, we don't deserve to be judged for it. And again, it's not, the drugs themselves aren't dangerous all the time. It's the policies that have been the most dangerous. Any substance can be dangerous, right? Coffee can be dangerous if you drink too much of it.
Totally. Kale can be dangerous.
When we
Right?
don't have the
Yeah.
real conversations around safety and harm reduction for every substance, then we lose a lot of knowledge around these substances, right? And so, yeah, I think that it's really, really hard to do this work, especially directly with Black communities, because we've been so harmed by the war on drugs. And when you talk about, you know, pushing the envelope and starting a conversation around using drugs recreationally, and people get really like, whoa, 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 no, like I saw my uncle like die from addiction, or I saw how much it ruined his life. And so it's very, very complicated. But you know, that's something I hope to do, is just really educate people more on not only the substances, but also helping them understand that the drugs aren't that dangerous themselves. It is the circumstance that can dictate whether it's dangerous, right? So interactions with law enforcement, but then also something else like unresolved trauma. If that's a point that Carl Hart makes in his book. If you give someone who is, you know, financially stable, has a partner who loves them, has stable housing, and, you know, a good support system, if they do meth, they're not likely to get addicted, right? But if you have someone who has some very deep unresolved trauma, who has income, but it may not be as high or as stable, and then a lack of support system around them, who's more likely to get addicted, right? The person who has less access to resources. So yeah, it's not
Absolutely.
about the substances. It's about all of these external factors that that drive people to addiction.
One of the questions that I sit with a lot, you know, I'm a white person, and I sit with the question of like, how could that happen, right?
Mhm.
Like, how could slavery happen? And the answer that I come to is, okay, well, if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to be an oppressor, right? I'm going to create harm, that kind of impact, I have to
Mhm.
not feel it, right? I have to
Mhm.
not be able to feel it. And in that way that I just want to run this by you, because this is kind of what's coming out of as I'm listening to you. In that way that I can't remember the term for it, but like it's some kind of projection. But like, for example, when the president was like, this is a witch hunt about himself, right? Like when we take whatever the thing is that we're doing and we say that we're the victim of it, whatever that technology
Mhm.
is, manipulation, my sense of that piece of like, you know, if I'm going to own slaves, I have to not be able to feel that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to project it onto my slaves
Mhm.
that they
Mhm.
can't feel, right? And I'm just guessing that that is possibly part of the root of that belief of white supremacy, that the color, the depth of melanin in someone's skin and where they're from indicates what level of
Mhm.
pain tolerance they have, right? Because that was definitely part of the whatever the trope or the meme, right? Of like, oh, Black people don't feel pain in the same way, right? And I think that there's, and maybe you'll speak to this a little bit, that because how this gets translated into folks who seek support from Western medicine, right? How the same thing that you're talking about is, oh, that's drug seeking behavior, right? Or like, oh, that's addict behavior, rather than acknowledgement of the pain that someone is feeling. And it's a place definitely that the white supremacy plays out. And I wonder if there's any, I'm guessing that there's deep roots in that particular thing in terms like, and the connection between the war on drugs, right? Because like if what I'm hearing you say, and what I also agree with, is that like sometimes we do drugs for pleasure, sometimes we do drugs to get out of pain, sometimes we do drugs because our bodies developed a physical dependency, but that piece of it, right? The like, I can't feel, so therefore you can't feel. I just wonder how to like, how to get at that and unwind it and make that part visible. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
That's, it makes me think of a social media post that's been going around recently that was like, okay, we know that because of enslavement and other intergenerational trauma and racial trauma, that it gets passed on and results in X, Y, and Z. But what about the people who were doing the enslavement? Like, what happens to that? Like, is that intergenerational as well? Does that get passed down as well through like the epigenetic fingerprint? And so, yeah, it makes me think of that. And that's a very, very deep question in terms of like, you can't feel, or I can't feel, so you can't feel either. It's almost like a projection.
Oh, totally. Complete projection. Yeah.
At the same time, knowing just like the history, it's like this, I don't know, this sadistic mindset.
Yes, absolutely.
For a long time, we were just seen as objects or as property. And the history of experimentation on Black people, Black women in particular, I feel like that stuff kind of, it carries over because it's basically saying that like, you are not in charge of your body. Therefore, like, I am, and I know what's best for you. And so when you take that into the context of the war on drugs, it's kind of saying like, you don't know what's best for you. You can't make your own decision around
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah.
And if you do, I'm going to punish you for it. And so, yeah, it's that like bodily autonomy piece again, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so that stigma also plays a role in that, because it's like, oh, you're a Black person, you're too dumb, or you're too, I don't know, uncivilized to really know what you're doing. And that was a lot of early science in the 19th century was supporting like racism. And so when you take that and apply it to medicine and the health world, I feel like those ideas are still kind of in play there. And that's why, you see when Black people have pain in the hospital, we're doubted, we're treated differently, we're seen as people who are just trying to get their fix on painkillers and things like that. So that attitude is still very much present in the medical field. And the whole notion of us not feeling pain is connected to that. It's very, very strange, I think I think that's something that I want to sit with myself and like think that through more. Yeah.
Yeah. It felt important to start to try and, okay, how are all these dots connecting? And I'm sure, you've thought a lot about it, but they seem like that impact, right, is Yeah, just I think you hit it when you said bodily autonomy. The ultimate being, we're going to put you in prison, and and then you will have no body autonomy, right?
Yeah.
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 Thanks for going there with me, just like on
Oh,
that
yeah.
little mental exploration. I want to just ask you about a little bit more about the collective, and see what feels right to share about it.
Sure. Yeah. So, POC Psychedelic Collective was really born out of conversations around the lack of diversity within the psychedelic space. After my internship at DPA and I graduated from college, I worked for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and they're the leading psychedelic research organization out there. And it was a really interesting experience for me. I was only there for about 8 months, but I felt like I learned a lot about the potential of psychedelics, the therapeutic uses, and things like that. But at the same time, I wasn't really seeing people who looked like me in research or speaking about this, and then also just being involved in these studies. There weren't many Black people being recruited to be study subjects. And so, after I left MAPS, I moved back east and got my job at DPA, but I still wanted to, be involved in psychedelic work because it impacted me in such a positive way. And so I connected with a bunch of other people through a panel at one of DPA's conferences, and we started convening online. And it was very unstructured at first, just talking about random things, and then I wanted to add more structure to it and actually use that space to create a platform for folks of color to really open up that space, and not to only give myself a voice, but to give other people a platform to use their voice. Because the psychedelic world, as much as these people like to say that, they have experienced mind, bending their mind and consciousness through these substances, it's very racist. And it comes out in different ways. Just speaking about racism in these psychedelic spaces, you will get so much racism. I remember I was giving a talk last year in Oakland at this event called the Women's Visionary Congress, and I was talking about why there is a need for POC intentional healing spaces, right? And after my talk, people were very moved by it because the way I speak is very matter of factly. I get that from my mom. She was always on her soapbox growing up. And also just being from South Carolina, I feel very confident in speaking about race in very direct terms. And so after my talk, people were asking really good questions. And then this one white guy says, well, what if I created a whites only conference? How would you feel about that? And I'm just like, well, that's basically what your organization already does. So you're really not doing anything different. And if you want to compare the work that I'm doing of creating POC intentional healing spaces to white only spaces, which was already a thing, then feel free. But you clearly missed the point. And so, our work isn't simply combating racism in the psychedelic space. It's definitely not that, because I don't want to center white people. That's the point. My work is really about creating spaces for people to learn about these substances and to also learn about it in the context of the war on drugs. And so it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the stigma that a lot of us have internalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
In not feeling comfortable to be able to speak about these things openly. That's really what it's about, is creating a space for people to do that and to share their experiences through, we had a conference last year in DC, and we had a retreat last year in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we've had other events like online because of COVID. And then also years before that, we had other panels in DC and Philadelphia. And so that's really what it's about, is just creating that space, that dialogue that hasn't been happening in the psychedelic world through a very intersectional framework. I know that intersectionality is a trendy term that people like to throw around, but I really mean that. And I'm very thankful for Kimberly Crenshaw's work. And because for me as a Black woman, it's helped me be able to articulate my experiences, not only in psychedelics, but throughout my entire life. And so bringing that kind of understanding and framework to psychedelics is important because, what we have here is psychedelics are poised to be legalized or decriminalized very soon in the US, much like marijuana has been. And I think Michelle Alexander was the person who said that white men are making tons of money off marijuana, and there's a bunch of Black men who are in prison because of that same thing now. And so with psychedelics, it won't exactly be the same thing. It would be a lot of these tech and, venture capital firms want to make money off psychedelics because they want to push productivity and a very individualistic way of healing. But you can't talk about psychedelics without talking about colonization and without talking about enslavement and the impact that has had on erasing and destroying our ancestral wisdom around plants and fungi and things like that, right? So I think for me, that's part of it, is to really make our voice known in this space and let these people know that, like, hey, we're looking at you and we're watching what you're doing, and we have something to say about it. And we're also going to build, solidarity with folks who are still being affected by these kind of things. Like, for example, with the peyote, that is something that is sacred and in danger right now. And we have to talk about that. And we also have to talk about ayahuasca tourism and how that's impacting groups throughout South America. And lastly, it's really about giving people the education that they need to make better choices to heal, right? So if someone can learn from me the safe uses and information around certain substances, and they can make a better judgment call for themselves whether they're at a party, whether they're out on a camping trip, that's all I care about, And I also, I think that part of our work is also using psychedelics to help us reimagine a better society, a better world. The conversation of abolishing the police and defunding the police has come up, obviously for good reason. And it's many people have been waiting for this conversation to take the national stage. And it's funny because I saw these posts going around on social media with people being like, oh, just give cops acid, give cops ayahuasca, and they'll be better. And it just goes to show that, again, folks in the psychedelic space aren't very attuned to the history and the decades of Black liberation work, where we've literally been saying for years that policing cannot be reformed, right? It has its roots in slave patrol. And so centering police in a dialogue about healing, to me, is just a slap in the face. And psychedelics shouldn't be used to heal our oppressors. Like, to me, that's like nonsense. It's really about helping our people see themselves in a different context, right? And psychedelics do that, especially mushrooms, in my opinion. They help you see yourself in a more compassionate lens, in a more acceptance. I think that's the term that Tara Brach likes to use, radical acceptance. It helps you see the good, the bad, all of those experiences in your life. And you just look at it and you can like almost laugh at all of that and just say, like, this happened and it was terrible, but I'm still here. And I think if we can give ourselves more compassion and more love and see ourselves through that lens more often, then we can also understand better that these systems of white supremacy that affect us, that COVID has brought out all of the issues with these systems. If we can see that these systems were not built for us in the first place, then having that awareness will allow us to take a step closer to our liberation, in my opinion.
Ife, I am so grateful to hear you talk about this, and really think this is a conversation that could continue to deepen and unfurl as we talked more and more through these layers. I just left with a lot of questions from our conversation, like, oh, I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about this, I want to talk about this. And just like really grateful to know that you're doing this work of the cultural healing and really tending to that is what I hear. Like, okay, and here are some medicines that we can use to reestablish that wellness that is centered in us, right? That is us centric, and just so grateful to you for putting your life towards that work, because it's so great and necessary. And I honor that, and I'm doing that on the other side, with my people. So yeah, really grateful. And if folks want to get in touch with you, they could go to your Twitter, which is twitter.com if3tay0, yeah. Or also the People of Color Psychedelic Collective, which is POC Psychedelics.com. So thank you so much for listening and for coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you so much, Pavini. This is really great. And I hope that we can continue to talk in the future.
Yeah, I think maybe there's some overlap in our work. I have a bug that I'm going to put in your ear. But I'm going to end the recording here. So folks who have been listening, this has been a lovely conversation with Ifetayo Harvey, and check out her work. And if you have enjoyed listening to this, write to me. Let me know. I want to hear about who you want to hear on the podcast, what questions are coming up for you, what changes are happening in your lives because of these conversations. You can go to bespokenbones.com and write into us. So I am Pavini Moray. This is Bespoken Bones, and we will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.